And welcome to another video. I'm Tandy, and today we're going to be looking over the spoiler for Wilds of Eldraine, the brand new set for Magic the Gathering, where we are returning for the first time. We are returning to the plane of Eldraine, a storybook plane with a lot of representation among, the old Beetle and Grimm, the old Brothers Grimm, rather, and a heavy emphasis on that lore. The cards will often depict famous characters such as, Jack on the Beanstalk fighting the giants, gingerbread, characters rising up to fight, corrupt queens and kings. And there's also a really awesome, video from the original Eldraine release where one of the planeswalkers, Garrick, Wildspeaker, ends up eating one of the gingerbread cookies that are sentient. And there's a character that we're going to get to who is the, partner of the gingerbread person who was bitten in half. And her card is great. And I can't wait to show y'all. So let's go ahead and get to the nitty gritty. We're going to do a set review under the guise of Pioneer Constructed Playability. And we're going to talk about these cards in that realm and how they will affect that realm. And we're going to go kind of fast on some of these because some of them I don't think are going to be that good for constructed play. But I would love to just, spitball some ideas that we have going on. So first up, we have Agatha of the Vile Cauldron. For red and green, you get a 1/1 legend, Human Warlock. Says, activate abilities of creatures you control cost X less to activate, where X is Agatha of the Vile Cauldron's power. This effect can't reduce the mana in that cost to less than 1 mana. For 6, you may give other creatures you control +1/+1 and trample and haste until end of turn. So basically, if we're able to grow Agatha's power, we can make her ability much cheaper, and then her ability fuels herself again, and so on and so on, for as much red and green as you have. We'll be looking at things like maybe Become Immense to pump this so that the activated ability is like super cheap. We'll be looking to pair this with, enchant creatures that will increase the power dramatically. While it's not in Pioneer specifically, something like Rancor or Audacity, which is in Pioneer, could be great with Agatha. It's also another card on a long list of cards that are potentially viable along with Bard class, an enchantment that can also reduce the cost of Agatha to free, and then you can spend all of your mana every turn activating Agatha's ability whenever you play one of those free legends. So a really powerful potential card. There's a reason it's a mythic rare. It doesn't look that great on paper, but I think the first time you buff it to 3 to 5 power, or 3 to 4 power, you're just really going to see how ridiculous it is. Big fan of Agatha. Cool Duck says, good job with all kind of stuff. I appreciate your efforts in jumpstarting the scene. Yo, thanks, Cool Duck. I'm excited to do it myself. Nice, Mopier. We're going to do a lot of Lorcana chats later on, and any questions you have, we'll definitely talk about them. Because that is something that's going to be really important to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions. So if you're here for Lorcana stuff, great. Ask away. I'll do my best to answer. Next up, card number 2, we have Agatha's Soul Cauldron. For 2 mana, you get a legendary artifact. Says, you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to activate abilities of creatures you control. Creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them have all activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. And you may tap and exile a target card from any graveyard. When a creature card is exiled this way, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So first and foremost, this is the card that's going to get absolutely broken at some point. There was an old card called Necrotic Ooze, which was a 4 mana 4/3 that had the activated ability of every creature in the graveyard. And ultimately, Agatha's Soul Cauldron is very similar to Necrotic Ooze, but it's a little bit harder to turn on, but it's a lot less vulnerable to removal. And the fact that it's so cheap, it starts as active, aggressive graveyard interaction to eat your opponent's graveyard if you need, and then kind of cobbles into some combos later on by putting some counters on your creatures, maybe even doing it mid-combat as a surprise effect. And then all your creatures gaining activated abilities of things in the graveyard. I could see this going in a number of like Golgari strategies that self-mill. This pairs really nicely with stuff like Satyr Wayfinder, things that help you self-mill. And then you can give those creatures abilities with Agatha's Soul Cauldron later on. And if those abilities are relatively cheap, then you'll get some really powerful stuff going on with your State of Wayfinders and anything that has a +1/+1 counter on it. Big fan of Agatha Soul Cauldron. One of those cards that's impossible to really showcase exactly what it can do until someone breaks it wide open. Do you think Deathrite Shaman could be in the deck? Yeah, Deathrite Shaman seems like a great potential card for this deck. Making all of your cards into Deathrite Shaman as your self-milling seems really sweet, you know? And then giving Deathrite Shaman, Satyr Wayfinder, even Stitcher Supplier, like giving those cards activated abilities later on seems like a really nice thing to do. Kind of turns your Reanimator deck on its head, right? This is giving an activated ability to stuff like, for example, Borborygmos Enrage lets you discard a land to deal 3 damage to any target. And if you're playing Mulch, you know, 1 in a green, flip the top 4, put all lands in your hand. Then if you flip over Borborygmos, you can make one of your small creatures into a Borborygmos clone. And then your small things can discard those lands to deal 3. That's just like one example that I can think of off the top of my head that you can do with Agatha, Soul Cauldron, and Pioneer. And that was like not even prepared. That's just like something I thought of just now. This seems kind of cool. So Agatha Soul Cauldron, extremely awesome card. Very curious to see how it impacts every format it touches. Artifacts like this generally are much stronger than we see at first because people find mini combos with them to do ridiculous stuff. Next up, Ashiok Wicked Manipulator. This one's got a lot of text on it. So 5 mana. 1 second. Leave me alone. All right, so next up, Ashiok Wicked Manipulator. This one's got a lot of text. Let's go ahead and get into it. 3 and 2 black for a 5 loyalty planeswalker. Says if you would pay life while your library has at least that many cards in it, exile that many cards from the top of your library instead. So basically, when you're paying for spells to be life, your library can cast those spells instead of your life total. +1, look at the top 2 cards of your library, exile 1, put the other in your hand. -2, create 2 1/1 Black Nightmare creature tokens with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, if a card was put into exile this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So basically, you make 2 tokens, you do something that can exile cards from the top of your deck, like paying life or whatever, and then when it becomes beginning to the beginning of combat step, those 2 cards will each get those 2 tokens will each get a +1/+1 counter. This is a once a turn trigger that is a check and not something that happens every time you exile stuff. So it's preventing some like micro combos, but suffice it to say that you're going to -2, make some 1/1s, and then over the next few turns, you'll probably -2 again, make some more 1/1s, and then exile something, and then they'll all become 2/2s, and then they'll just slowly grow every turn. And then -7, target player exiles the top X cards of their library, where X is the total mana value of cards you own in exile. So that -7 can be pretty powerful. If you're starting it on an empty battlefield, +1/+1 into -7 seems extremely doable. So if you have a deck that has a lot of ways to pay life to do stuff, you can exile large chunks of your deck and then hopefully combo kill your opponent with the -7. This is a ton of words on a card. I'm not 100% that it's going to see much play, but it's a mythic rare with a lot of words, so it's likely going to be better than anyone thinks. All right, next up, Asinine Antics, probably one of the best names for a card so far. Turning things into donkeys, it looks like. That's very funny. So Asinine Antics is 2 and 2 blue, sorcery. You may cast Asinine Antics as though it had flash if you pay 2 more to cast it. For each creature your opponents control, create a curse roll token attached to that creature. It says if you control another roll on it, put that card put that roll into the graveyard. Enchanted creature is a 1/1. It doesn't lose all its abilities. That's important to note. So this is not quite like mass polymorph or whatever, where you're just like turning things into useless iterations of themselves. But instead, they're just shrinking everything down to 1/1, and those things will all keep their abilities. It's not quite a Wrath of God effect. I could definitely see this being a nice little maneuver for blue decks who are trying to be really, preventative and damage output from the opponent. But it's bad against tokens, and it doesn't kill the things. So you're going to need some defensive measures already in place. There are quite a few cards that reduce, power of all creatures your opponents control. Maybe you could pair that with Asinine Antics to make them all irrelevant, while giving blue a pseudo, Wrath effect sweeper. Next up, Balloon Grand Squall. For Teamer colors, you get a 4/4. I actually haven't seen this card yet. This is awesome. I love Teamer cards. Legendary Giant Noble has one half of the card is Seek Thrills. And for Teamer and 2, it's an instant adventure. It says mill 7 cards. Then put all cards that have an adventure from among the milled cards into your hand. So this is adventure themed. And then it's 3 mana, 4/4 trample. It says permanent spells you cast that have an adventure cost, 1 less to cast. So very awesome in like a Teamer, adventure strategy featuring things like Love Struck Beast, Bone Crusher Giant. Later in the game, this is going to be a way for you to refuel pretty easily. And then also just help you cast your bodies of the adventure creatures that you did already play. Big fan of Balloona Grand Squall. This card looks awesome. It's very fair on rate. 3 mana, 4/4 trample. Relatively difficult to cast with Teamer mana, but overall something you can play as early as turn 2 off of, one of those Llanowar Elves, but it would require multiple dual lands to tap for the red and the blue. Maybe it's good with Gilded Goose, since Gilded Goose can be played off forests and still be used to play Balloona Grand Squall. But I would imagine that this is going to be in more of a Prosperous Innkeeper, Lucky Clover style of deck. Maybe this is the thing that brings Lucky Clover to the forefront of Pioneer. It was ultimately so dominant in Standard that it was banned, but hasn't seen much play in Pioneer as of yet. And Balloona Grand Squall can definitely help with that. Next up, Beseech the Mirror. This is a card that a lot of people have been talking about for maybe Modern. But Beseech the Mirror is 3 black and 1 for sorcery. Has Bargain, and Bargain is you may sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token as you cast a spell. This is quite strong with things like blood tokens, treasure tokens, creature tokens, as well as the rolls, which are enchantments and tokens, and any artifact, which we've previously mentioned. If you bargain it, it's extra powered. Here's what it does. So search your library for a card, any card. Exile it face down, then shuffle. If the spell was bargained, you may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost if that spell's mana value is 4 or less. Put the exiled card into your hand as if it wasn't cast this way. So 4 mana tutor or 4 mana sack something, tutor for a 4-drop or smaller, and play it. This is great for wrath effects. While Damnation doesn't exist in the format, we do have Languish. We have a few others that could be viable options for Beseech. And I think it'll be trivial to get a token, an artifact, or enchantment to sacrifice. I think Beseech the Mirror could be quite good. Can't wait to run Doom with it. We're going to play it with Doomsday in Legacy, I guess. Beseech the Mirror is just more virtual copies of Doomsday, I suppose. You can sack Lotus Petal, things of that nature. Good with Doom Foretold as well. That's true. Having more ways to tutor up. There's an enchantment, Demonic Bargain, that is really nice with things like Beseech the Mirror, because you can go get it, or you can go get a way to sacrifice it. And sacrificing it is often very important because the 4th ability on the card does end the game in your opponent's favor. And so you're always looking for some way to sacrifice it, and Beseech the Mirror seems like a nice bridge to hit there. Doom Foretold specifically is a little awkward with Bargain, because Doom Foretold is non-token for sacrificing, and so you won't want to pair it with Doom Foretold every time, but it is kind of cool with Doom Foretold in general. So there are plenty of cheap artifacts that we can or enchantments that we can sacrifice. Next up, Blossoming Tortoise, 2 and 2 green for a 3/3 turtle. When Blossoming Tortoise enters the battlefield or attacks, mill 3 cards, then return a land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Activate abilities of lands you control, cost 1 less to activate, and land creatures you control get +1/+1. So Blossoming Tortoise is going to fit right into Mono Green Devotion. I'm going to tell you that much right at the beginning. That's where Bobby Fortinelli, the Mono Green Master, is basically super into this card, and I am too. And what it does for Mono Green Devotion is many things, right? So first and foremost, when it enters play, you can mill 3 and get a land. That's a huge deal. If you are lucky enough to get a Nykthos, that's even better. The second ability, activate abilities of lands you control, costs 1 less to activate. That means your Lair of the Hydras are 1 bigger. That means your Nykthos costs 1 less to activate for the boost of mana. Both are very, very nice. And then lastly, land creatures you control get +1/+1. So combined with the activate ability and the +1/+1, your Lair of the Hydras are actually +2/+2 naturally. And what that does is that with Blossoming Tortoise, it allows you to maybe win some longer games that are your opponent has a lot of interaction and removal for your creatures, and so Lair of the Hydra can become like a real threat. And maybe we even go up on Lair of the Hydra to 3 or 4 copies because of how well it works with Blossoming Tortoise. But we have to be careful because as our third land, it does enter the battlefield tapped quite often. And if we find it off of Cavalier of Thorns, the land entering tapped could be bad because we often play Oath of Nissa and Llanowells off of the extra mana. Blossoming Tortoise, home run. It's only like $7 or whatever. If you plan on playing it in Mono Green Devotion, which I recommend, I would get them now before they spike. I think they're probably going to get up to $20 once people actually play with them and learn that the card is good. I think this card is phenomenal. Next up, Ariat of the Charmed Apple. 1 black and white for a 2/4 legendary human warlock. Says each creature that's enchanted by an aura you control can't attack you or planeswalkers you control. At the beginning of your incept, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of auras you control. So basically, this lets a lot of your weirder enchantments to be able to go on your opponent's stuff. Maybe it's like a cheap enchantment that draws a card that has a minor effect, but it turns them all into essentially pacifism, where your opponents can't use them to attack you or your planeswalkers. And then the Ariat just kind of drains them over time. Now, this is a weird one. I think this is going to be more for commander play, so I don't think we're going to see this too much constructed. But it's a 3-cost 2/4. That's a great stat line for cards like that. And I think the ability to drain your opponent means that like you can just put it on your own stuff. You know, put a bunch of enchantments on your own stuff. You have no downside. And also you just drain your opponent every turn. This could be good in those like Orzhov Aura decks that we saw when Lurrus was a big deal. This maybe fills the gap left by the banning of Lurrus. We'll see. But Ariat seems really interesting, although I'm not sure if it has a home right now. But this is definitely a card that people could build a deck around. And with stuff like, oh, not 8.5 Tails. What's it called? It's the one that's crazy in the Auras deck, the newer one from I want to say Neon Dynasty, Kamigawa. Anyway, there's a new 2-drop that's crazy in the Ariat of Charmed Apple deck. All the glitters is good. I'm talking about the creature. It's the one that whenever you play an enchantment on it or anywhere, you can like go get another enchantment and put it on it. It's a freaking, it's 8.5 Tails Descendant or whatever. I can't remember the name. Yes, Light Paws. Light Paws is ridiculous with Ariat. All right. Next up, we're going to move on to Hilda of the Icy Crown. For 2 white and a blue, you get a 3/4 legendary human warlock. It says whenever you tap an untapped creature an opponent controls, you may pay 1. When you do, choose 1. Create a 4/4 white and blue elemental. Put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. Scry 2 and draw a card. So this pairs well with those freeze mechanics that we have seen be major players in limited, but usually not so good in constructed. This might change that. You know, I haven't seen an Icy Manipulator in play in a long time, but this is a type of card that, along with Icy Manipulator, could have been dominant in its standard heyday. And while I think that maybe that time has passed, you know, there's probably some creatures that can tap an opponent's thing for 0 or 1 mana, and we can maybe pair that with Hilda to be like a human aggro deck that has a bit of a freeze mechanic or tapping down mechanic, and then the ability to turn that tapping into +1/+1 counters on everything, or 4/4s. The Scry 2 draw card is there for when you're like low in resources or whatever, but this could be good with like Giant Killer, for example. Giant Killer can tap down opposing creatures. There's like Gideon's Lawkeeper, stuff like that. And then there's also just a host of blue cards that do something very similar. Cool card. I think it's unlikely to see play, but I'm very happy to be wrong on it. Next up, Kellen the Fey-Blooded. 2 and a red for a legendary human fairy. It's a 2/2 with double strike. Other creatures you control get +1/+0 for each aura and equipment attached to Kellen the Fey-Blooded. And then it's an adventure, and it's Birthright Boon. For a white and 1 sorcery, search your library for an aura or equipment card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So long story short, Kellen is kind of like a slow Stoneforge Mystic, which is right at the correct power level, I think, for Pioneer. Stoneforge Mystic, I think, a bit too good. Just remember that both Hammer and Sigarda's Aid are legal in Pioneer, And the only thing holding back the hammer deck from modern to being in Pioneer is specifically the payoffs and the things that create consistency. Sorry, excuse me. The payoffs exist already. The things that create consistency don't. The Pure Steel Paladin, the Stoneforge Mystic, and even Urza Saga. Those are cards that don't exist in Pioneer. But Kellen Fayblooded is like step one in maybe attaining something similar, where we have the ability to tutor. You know, the Birthright Boon is literally just a card that exists, but it's the one that exists is worse. Steel Shaper's Gift costs a white and only goes and gets an equipment. But for a white and one, we get an aura equipment, and then, you know, Kellen can go into either an Aura's deck or an equipment deck with, you know, Sigarda's Aiden Hammer. And I think that just makes it into a potentially interesting card because of those two effects and those two pairings. I've been killed on turn 2 in Pioneer before with Hammer and Sigarda's Aid, so it's definitely possible. And Kellen is just like another thing that can increase the consistency. Next up, Moonshaker Cavalry, 5 and 3 white for a 6/6 flyer, Spirit Knight. Says when Moonshaker Cavalry enters the battlefield, creatures you control gain flying and get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. This is essentially a big Craterhoof type card. I don't think it's in the right colors. You know, green with Craterhoof meant you could play a bunch of mana dorks to allow you to accelerate into Craterhoof, and then you had a payoff. Your Craterhoof allowed your mana dorks to actually attack for lethal sometimes. Moonshaker Cavalry doesn't really have that. I'm uncertain it'll see any play in Pioneer at all. It doesn't grant itself haste either. You know, like one of the big damage swings with Crater Behemoth was giving itself haste. So when you cast it, it was attacking for a huge chunk along with your other things. I think Moonshaker Cavalry is a cool card for Commander. I doubt it'll see much play in Pioneer. I think there's a lot of limitations for it. And people don't even play Crater of Behemoth, which I'm pretty sure is legal. So next up, Realm Scorcher Hellkite, 4 and 2 red for a 4/6 with Bargain. Has flying haste. When Realm Scorcher Hellkite enters the battlefield, if it was Bargain, add 4 mana of any combination of colors. So that's pretty sick right there. If you sack a blood token, a treasure, or an enchantment, or whatever, you get 4 mana, rebate for this 6 mana dragon. It already is a 4/6 flying haste. And then it also has the ability for a red and 1 to deal 1 damage to any target. So, long story short, if you sack a thing when you cast it, you can get 4 mana, and you already have a mana sink for the 4 mana to deal 2 damage spread around however you want. And then it's also 4/6 flying haste, so it's hard to interact with. It has haste, so it hits you immediately and can deal some extra damage, spray down some of your elves, yada, yada, yada. When you untap, having that ability to spend 2 to deal 1 to anything, that's like a dream for someone 10 years ago, 20 years ago. This card is incredible. It's like a lot of work to get to 6 mana these days and to have it still be good. But Realm Scorcher Hellkite, I think, is just a really solid card. And I wouldn't be surprised if this fit into decks that are trying to ramp up a little bit. You might even see this in something like a mono red devotion with blood tokens. You know, maybe some things that can sacrifice, like experimental synthesizer, stuff like that. Realm Scorcher Hellkite is just a really powerful card, and I'm interested to see what people can do with it. Big shout out to Chappie for the follow. Appreciate you. How do deck are you currently playing in Lorcana? Direwire, I'm still accumulating cards, and I'm about to start playing a lot on Pixelborn. My thing I'm leaning into right now is going to be Stitch Rockstar with a bunch of 1 and 2 drops, bodyguards, things like that to protect the 1 drops. I think it's going to be great. That's the deck I think I can build it to maybe beat the Ruby Amethyst deck. All right, next up, Rowan Sign of War. Red, black 1 for a human wizard with Menace. And it says, tap spells you cast this turn that are black and or red cost X less to cast, where X is the amount of life you've lost this turn, activated as sorcery. This is probably going to be powerful with some things that allow you to pay some life as static effects. But I think this is more so going to be useful in like modern with fetch lands, because fetch lands kind of represent the ability to deal yourself 3 damage pretty easily. And Rowan seems like a really powerful card when you're able to easily deal yourself damage. I think at Commander, it's going to do way more powerful, ridiculous stuff. I think in Modern and Pioneer, it's going to be a little harder to get going. But Modern's where I see it maybe making the biggest impact because of the fetch land thing. Pioneer, I don't think it's going to see much play. Very happy to be wrong on this, but I think we're going to just move on. Yeah, playing turn 1 Rowan's pretty tough, though. You have to have like multiple fast mana things or whatever. All right, next up, Tally and the Conley Lord. This is a 2 and a black and a blue for a 3/4 legendary fairy noble. That's flying. It says, as Tally and the Conley Lord enters the battlefield, choose a number between 1 and 10. Whenever an opponent casts a spell with mana value, power, or toughness equal to the chosen number, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. So, long story short, this is a nice Punisher card against decks with lots of the same mana value of 1 and 2. This is great against like mono red, for example. But the fact that it makes your opponent lose 2 life instead of gain 2 life doesn't really feel like a control card to me. This feels more like a tempo card where you play this when you're beaten down with flyers. You name 1, 2, or 3 or whatever. And then when your opponent plays into it, you draw cards and they lose life, I know some people have already talked about putting this at the top end of like a blue-black control deck in Pioneer. I don't think it's going to go there. I think that we're just going to see this in like a blue-black deck with a bit of bounce, a bit of removal, creatures that are tricky, creatures that can have evasion. And overall, though, 4 toughness is a big deal. I think this card's pretty cool, but I'll have to see it in play before I make a final judgment on if it's good or not. I appreciate you, chap. All right, next up, we're going to move into some of the virtues. This is a new card type that are enchantments on the front half, and they are spells with the adventure mechanic on the other half. So Virtue of Courage is a 3 and 2 red for an enchantment. It says, whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, you may exile that many cards from the top of your library. You may play those cards this turn. So normally this would be something that like doubles damage, right? But this card is much different than that type of effect that we're used to. This basically lets you bottle X number of cards off the top of your deck whenever you deal some damage, and then you can play those cards essentially until the end of turn. So it's creating like if you attack with a couple of 2/2s and your opponent blocks 1 or 2 of them, but you deal some damage, you get to flip cards off the top of your deck for each time you're able to deal damage, and then you may play those cards. It's pretty great. You can chain off, shock effects so that you deal 2, deal 2, deal 2 just by casting them off top. Maybe it works well in something like Boros Pia, but it's pretty expensive. 5 is a lot to ask. Now, the money on this is that the 5 cost card doesn't have to be good. If the 2 cost version is good or playable, one of them essentially gets to be free. So Embereth Blaze is a red 1 instant adventure, and it deals 2 damage to any target. So this card essentially acts like a Bone Crusher Giant, where on turn 2 you're going to have something to do, and then later in the game you'll have a card to play that has a significant impact on the game. I wish that Embereth Blaze dealt 3 damage to creatures or planeswalkers, and then the other side of it would be, something you can use with other burn spells as a payoff. They made it so that multiple copies of Virtue can kind of work together, but I think that it's going to be very limiting because 2 damage for 2 mana is like obviously a tough ask. On Bone Crusher Giant, I think it gets a pass because there's so many things like Llanowar Elves that you just have to kill in the format. But being on the draw with a stomp is sometimes too slow, and it's more of like supplementary removal alongside Fatal Push, which can kill something for 1 mana in the early turns. But people build with Bone Crusher Giant in mind, and all the things that people have been using to dodge Bone Crusher Giant, the Embereth Blaze is going to fail as well. And the downside, though, is that Bone Crusher Giant only costs 3 to actually have a significant impact as a body on the battlefield, whereas Virtue of Courage is only good when you're like attacking, and it's only good when you're like throwing burn spells at the opponent to like kind of churn up, find more spells to cast. Very experimental frenzy-esque as Virtue of Courage, but works, only it's limited to things that deal damage to your opponent. So I think that this card has a little too many words for having too small of an effect on the game, but it's certainly interesting, and it's certainly a card that I'm gonna look at doing some testing. 2 to deal 2 to any target is nothing to sneeze at, and you gotta test out the other half to see if it's good. I'm not really sure what type of deck wants this card though, because 5 mana for an enchantment is quite a bit for a deck that wants to do a lot of attacking. I think something like Showdown of the Skalds is much more reasonable cost wise, and already has seen a lot of play in the Boros decks, and I think that's where we're going to be. Next up, Virtue of Knowledge, 5 cost enchantment for blue. If a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So double triggers. And then Vantress Visions, a blue and 1 instant adventure. Copy target activated or triggered ability you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. If this didn't say you control, I think this card would be a home run. I think because you have to target your own stuff, it's going to be a little too complicated for newer players, and B, a little too hard to use in a tournament setting without doing something that's extremely broken. I have to imagine that this card was run through a lot of testing, and I assume that at some point Vantress Vision could target anything. It was probably too good. But as it stands, I think this card is just commander fodder, not really for constructed play. 60v60. All right, next up, Virtue of Loyalty. This is the white virtue. 3 and 2 white enchantment says at the beginning of your end step, put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control and tap those creatures. That's an immediate, powerful effect that aggressive white decks will want. Maybe decks that have a lot of toughness can, really put this to great use. I think that this type of card is excellent as a top end of aggressive creature decks. So the other half needs to be a threat, which it is. Ardenvale Fealty, white and 1 for an adventure, says create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance, and it is an instant. So you can, ambush some 1/1s if your opponent's not careful. But it's a threat on 2 that's relatively weak, but later in the game, it becomes something much stronger as a way to bolster your remaining forces. This is going to be an excellent standard card. Excellent. And it could break into Pioneer, and I'll be excited to see if and when it does. Next up, Virtue of Persistence. This is the 7-mana black enchantment. Says at the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Very powerful effect. We've seen this before on 7 drops. Lockthwain Scorn, 2-cost adventure. Sorcery. Target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. You gain 2 life. This one's a home run, folks. This one is the money. Front half, -3/-3, gain 2 life. While being a sorcery, I think limits it slightly. I think that it's very strong for just the 2 cost. And I wouldn't be surprised to see this card cropping up in a lot of like Rakdos mid-range decks as a 2-mana piece of interaction that they've been looking for to replace, Dreadbore, things of that nature. And then now we just have this 7-drop on top of our removal spell that dominates the late game. Dominates the late game. One thing I would have loved to see on this card is target creature gets -3/-3 till end of turn, and then target player gains 2 life. That way your opponent can't sacrifice their thing in response, kill their own card in response to essentially cancel the spell. Because if the target disappears on the -3/-3, you're left with the Virtue of Persistence going to the graveyard instead of into the adventure zone. Cool card though. Yes, not just your graveyard. That's a big one. Next up, Virtue of Strength, 5 and 2 green for an enchantment. Says if you tap a basic land for mana, produces 3 times that mana instead. We have this already with an elemental from a past set, maybe a Tree Folk, 7 mana, green card, triples your mana generation. Very powerful. This specifically says basic land, so it's going to limit you a bit to playing like mono green or just like things with Kodama's Reach or Cultivate that can get a bunch of lands out of your deck in Pioneer. So a very powerful mana ability. Next on the card is the Garden Brig Growth, which is the adventure part. For 1 green, you can return target creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. So, early on you play like Elena Wells. If it dies, great. You get it back. With Virtue of Strength, you replay it. I think this is a really interesting card. I'll be paying attention to people who are trying to put this in decks. I think it's very expensive to cast Virtue of Strength. And the payoff, like you're already at 7. I would have liked to have seen that cost like 5 or 6 and double mana instead. For 7, you're going to hit Commander more often than you're going to hit competitive constructed. But I think Virtue of Strength is quite Quite interesting. All right, we're gonna take a breather here since we just did the virtues. We're almost done with the mythic rares. How's it going, chat? How are you today? We're doing a WoW set review for Pioneer. We're doing some Lorcana discussion in the meantime, and we're going to be talking more about Lorcana very soon. Maybe mini pet. I just don't think that you need it, right? It's something that costs 7 that generates more mana and constructed. It's just like not ideal, right? I think it's okay in Commander. You can ramp into it pretty quickly. You can build your deck with it in mind. But Mono Green Devotion does not need more mana generation. It has plenty. All right, moving on. Elsewhere it says, Lorcana, say I'm adamant about a princess deck. What color do you think I should pair with yellow, so aka Amber, Rapunzel and Mona, and maybe Ariel? So if it's the 3-cost Ariel that's a singer, I'd recommend pairing it with Steel. You can maybe play more aggressive, low to the ground, and you could play Whole New World, which lets you draw 7, and then you can use Ariel to sing it. You can also play another awesome song called Grab Your Sword, which deals 2 to everything. There also is Sapphire, which has a bunch of acceleration, and you may want that as the focal point of your deck. I'm just not sure that the princess payoff specifically is there. Yo, Isosceles, thank you for the 6 months. Appreciate that Prime sub. Whole New World sucks. I think people are building it poorly, Agi, but I think if you play a deck with like 50, 1 and 2 drops, it'll be great. I mean, it's Wheel of Fortune. We all know from playing those type of effects in Magic that if you give your opponent 7 cards before you get 7 cards, the goal is to empty your hand. The goal is to go 1 drop into Ariel, into 1 drop, cast it for free off Ariel, right? Ariel. All right, here we go. Next up, we have Will Sign of Peace. This is human wizard for 1 blue and a white for a 2/4 vigilance. It says tap spells you cast this turn that are white and or blue cost X less to cast, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. Basically the opposite of Rowan. Will and Rowan are planeswalkers that have lost their spark, and I assume that they're trapped here in the plane of Eldraine. Or, they can move between planes some other way. But this is the opposite, essentially, of the Rakdos sister. And similar concept, though. You gain some life, you tap it, you can use its ability to play a bunch more stuff. You can maybe tap it and untap it, so you get to double the effect. And I don't know, it's pretty cool. Pretty cool card. Not sure where it's going to fit in Pioneer. Maybe you can play it with creatures that have static effects that like gain life whenever something enters the battlefield on your side, creature tokens and such. All right. Will they share a spark? I don't know, Diabetes. That's not something I look too much into in the lore. But I also know that most of the planeswalkers, if not all of them, lost their sparks. But I know that they can travel between planes. I think it's because of the world tree. But don't quote me on that. Like, they're going to have a racing set come out soon, like where there's a big race that goes into 3 different planes. And they use like, different methods of transport between the planes. All right, here we go. Next up, Archon of the Wild Rose. For 2 and 2 white, you get a 4/4 flyer. That's a great rate. Other creatures you control that are enchanted by auras you control have base power and toughness 4/4 and have flying. So you can play this. So like, let's say that in your enchantment deck, you play a couple of 1 and 2 mana things. On turn 3, you put an aura on 1 or both of them. And then on turn 4, you play Archon, and they have base 4/4, and then all the juice from their enchantments go on top of that. So Archon of the Wild Rose, pretty interesting in that regard. This feels like more of a win more card. I think if you're attacking with creatures that already have enchantments on them, you're usually doing very well. But with the role tokens being a more prominent factor in this set, I think there's a good chance that you see cards like Archon of the Wild Rose become much stronger because of those role tokens being enchantments. So I'll be interested to see any card that says when enchantment enters play, draw a card. Any card that says if your creature's enchanted, do a thing. I think all definitely you have to look at them with a different view. Cool card. Next up, a Tale for the Ages. Tale for the Ages is a white and 1. Enchanted creatures you control get +2/+2. So this is very similar to the Archon, where if you already have stuff that has enchantments on them, that means they're not dead, and that means that you're usually winning, because those enchantments are very often, in Pioneer at least, going to be things like ethereal armor, all that glitters, things that give evasion, and with Light Paws being a focal point, as well as SRAM Artificer, you're really trying to build up one creature to be large. And until for the Ages doesn't say for each enchantment you control, it's just your enchanted creatures get a static +2/+2 buff. I think unless you're putting a roll on all of your creatures, I think that Tale for the Ages is going to be pretty lackluster. That's my take. Next up, Bramble Familiar. Green and 1 for a 2/2. Elemental Raccoon. I think people are going to want it just because it's a raccoon. Have they ever made a raccoon before? That's a good question. I'll have to search. It says tap, add green, and then has green and 1 tap, discard a card, return Bramble Familiar to its owner's hand. So essentially, this is a mechanism where you can play it for 2, and then later on you can return it to your hand so that you can use the adventure. And the adventure is Fetch Quest for 5 and 2 green. It's a sorcery adventure. It says mill 7 cards, then put a creature, enchantment, or land card from among the milled cards onto the battlefield. This is a very powerful effect, coupled with a decent mana accelerator. And this is definitely something I could see in Mono Green Devotion as like a 1 or 2 of, as a way for you to essentially accelerate early. Tangled Florahedron is similar to Bramble Familiar in that it's a 2-cost mana accelerator that has an alternate mode that's quite good. And Bramble Familiar is the opposite of Tangled Florahedron, where Tangled Florahedron allows for early development smoothness, where Bramble Familiar allows for ramping, and then when that is paid off, you get an extra card to utilize once you're at that stage of the game with Nykthos trying to Nyx. So wouldn't be surprised to see a couple of Bramble Familiar. It's a little awkward since it only puts creature enchantments or lands into play. It doesn't work well with Karn the Great Creator or Kiora or Storm the Festival. And that's really where you're going to want Bramble Familiar to shine. But I could maybe see if they ever ban Karn the Great Creator or Storm the Festival or anything out of Mono Green Devotion that makes it weaker, you might see Burning Tree Emissary, Bramble Familiar versions pop back up. And then the Mill 7 could put something into play like Vorinclex 6 that gives everything double counters and reduces your opponent's counters in half. I think Bramble Familiar is definitely a sweet card, and it's hard to overstate how powerful the adventure cards can be. This is a split card that goes the opposite of most adventures, where the adventures are usually cheaper than the card itself, but Bramble Familiar, to compensate for that, has a way to reset itself and be cast. So big fan of this one. Next up, Charming Scoundrel. Red 1 for a 1/1 haste. When it enters the battlefield, choose one. Discard a card, then draw. Create a treasure, or create a wicked roll attached to target creature you control. And wicked rolls, I believe, give it +1/+1 and ward 1. So at the baseline, this is a 2 mana 2/2 haste ward 1, which is particularly strong. Excuse me, I don't think it's ward 1. I think it's when the creature dies, your opponent loses 1 life. They didn't put the reminder text on there because they didn't have room. But wicked roll, I believe, is when the creature dies or the wicked roll goes to the graveyard, each opponent loses 1 life, something like that. And then the alternates of this are it's a looter, or it creates a treasure. And I think that all modes of this Charming Scoundrel are very good. So I think this card's great. This is more for like a mid-rangey red deck than it's going to be for an aggressive red deck. But I have to imagine that a 2/2 haste wicked is going to be desirable for aggro decks. And then later in the game, if you need treasured ramp, you need to loot to get one of this extra lands out of your hand, the body's going to matter more than anything. Oh, me too, Snap Marvel. Wickets when it dies, the opponent loses 1 life. Nice. Royal is ward 1. Good to know. I also do like the art on this as well. Next up, Cruel Somnophage. Uh-oh, we're loading. All right, Cruel Somnophage. Black and 1 for a star nightmare. Cruel Somnophage's power and toughness are each equal to the number of creature cards in all graveyards. We've had this card in the past. It's called Oh, Necrovore, I think? Something very similar to Necrovore. There was a cycle of Lurgoyfs came out in, I believe, Odyssey or Onslaught block, and one of them was power toughness equal to the number of creature cards in all graveyards. And this card is very similar to that, but it has a whole extra ability attached to it. It's a adventure for a blue and one. It says can't wake up. It says target player mills 4 cards. And so you essentially can target yourself if you're a graveyard themed deck, or if you're a mill deck for you're trying to mill your opponent out, you can mill them and then just have a big creature. I think this is going to be pretty solid in decks that can mill self, but we actually have a Urborg Lorgoyf that was printed just a few sets ago that has a kicker that's very similar to this, and its power and toughness are very similar to this as well. So maybe just having extras of that type of effect is good. Next up is Decadent Dragon. This is another adventure. So for 4 mana, you get a 4/4 dragon, flying trample, great stats. When Decadent Dragon attacks, create a treasure token. All great, all upside, no downside. Practically unheard of 10 years ago. Next up, instant expensive taste is the adventure. 2 and a black, so this curves naturally. It says exile the top 2 cards of target opponent's library face down. You may look at and play those cards for as long as they remain exiled. This card's a home run. This is a nightmare to play against. You know, you get 2 cards off your opponent's deck, you can play them forever. Gonti was a card out of Kaladesh block that was quite strong, and it looked at the top 4 cards of your opponent's deck, and you picked one to put face down that you could play forever, regardless of whether or not the Gonti was in play still. Decadent Dragon takes that to a whole new level, being a pseudo divination that plays well off your opponent's deck, you know, and then has the ability to become flying trample, makes treasure tokens. The big downside is that you can only play the cards for the cost of the mana that they are. And so you'll need treasures in one way or another, or to be like a prismatic or 3 to 4, 5 color deck, playing triomes and things of that nature to be able to play the cards. Normally, cards like this say you can play them with any color mana, but this one specifically does not say that because you need to generate treasures. It's very similar to Ragavan, you know, in modern. Very cool card though. Maybe a mirror breaker in any sort of Rakdos mid-range matchup. Next up, Devouring Sugar Maw. 2 and 2 black for a 6/6 horror. Menace and trample, so it's hard to block. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token. If you don't, tap Devouring Sugar Maw. So doesn't deal you any damage. You do need fuel for it. You need to make those treasures. You need to make those blood tokens. And you need to make those roll tokens. And if you're able to do that, the Devouring Sugar Maw is a huge body with evasion that's difficult to kill outside of black spot removal and white exile spot removal. Have for dinner, a white and 1 for instant adventure. Create a 1/1 human creature token and a food token. So essentially, you get 2 pieces of fodder for it in itself, so that when you curve it naturally into 6 or into 4 for a 6/6, it's going to be huge. You have 2 turns essentially to be able to attack with it without disruption. I think this card is awesome and self-sustaining, and I'm very, very happy about it. I think this card is going to be great in a number of, you know, sacrifice decks. I would love to try this in like Tyvar Sacrifice, for example. Maybe just like a black-white token stack of some kind. Next up, Elusive Otter. This one's maybe my favorite card in the whole set. I don't want to talk about this one at length if we can. So for 1 blue mana, you get an Otter that's a 1/1 with prowess. Now, 1/1 with prowess might not mean much to most people, but to me, I've basically been looking for a 3rd prowess creature to go alongside Monastery Swiftspear and Soulscar Mage for Is It Aggro? And you can say, oh, there's been a couple that have been printed. Sure, they all have some sort of downside. They all have some negative effect that prevents them from being great alongside Swiftspear and Soulscar Mage. Elusive Otter has no problems with that. It's a 1/1 prowess. It even has another ability and another way to cast it. So creatures with power less than Elusive Otter's power can't block it. That means it's not going to get chump blocked. That means that the problems that Mono Red has sometimes where your opponent plays a bunch of 1/1s and uses those to protect their life total, Elusive Otter gets around that. I think that there is a universe where Elusive Otter becomes a better card than Soulscar Mage, though I do think that Monastery Swiftspear having haste has given it a huge leg up on both of these creatures, but Elusive Otter maybe being better than Soulscar Mage is a huge deal. The adventure cost is Grove's Bounty. It's a green and X sorcery. Distribute X counters among any number of target creatures you control. I think as long as you just play like some pathways that are green on one side, as long as you play maybe Copperline Gorge or a few shocklands from the Ravnica cycle in modern or in Pioneer specifically, you can cast Grove's Bounty with ease. And in modern, with the fetch lands into Stomping Ground and to Breeding Pool, you're going to be able to use Elusive Otter in so many different shells. And I'm a big Teamer head. I love Teamer as a color combination. I will have no problem fitting this into essentially every Izzet deck that I play and every Teamer deck that I build from here on out. I think this card is incredible. It's very good. It's also only $3. Next up, Elvish Archivist, green and 1 for an 0/1 Elf Artificer. Says whenever one or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control, put 2 counters on Elvish Archivist. This ability triggers only once each turn. And then whenever one or more enchantments enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. So this is kind of like in the vein of the old enchantresses. Some of them pumped themselves, some of them drew cards. This one does both, but only once a turn. It's going to scale pretty poorly as the game progresses. You know, it starts off small. It's only going to attack for 2 on the first turn and draw a card. That's okay. That's like something that you just kind of have to deal with. I think more than anything, this is not going to allow for explosive growth potential. And if you don't have explosive growth potential in Pioneer on something that's supposed to scale as the game progresses, I think Elvish Archivist is just going to be a relatively weak card. Now, I'd love to be proven wrong. This could be something that people play in those Enchantress-based decks. You know, this could be like another SRAM Artificer or whatever. Oh, it's artifacts, excuse me. So it's artifacts on one side and enchantments on the other side. So overall, I think just a little too scatterbrained. I think Elvish Archivist is not going to really hit. It doesn't really go into artifact decks or enchantment decks very well. The limiting factor on both makes it just not that desirable when we have ways to do something very similar without the limitation. Next up, Expel the Interlopers. For 5 mana, you get a sorcery. It says choose a number between 0 and 10. Destroy all creatures with power greater than or equal to the chosen number. So, Expel the Interlopers. A nice kind of targeted wrath. This is very similar to Dusk Dawn, a sweeper effect that we played in Standard, during Kaladesh Standard. And we would play all creatures that had 3 power or less, and then Dusk Dawn would blow up everything that was too big. And Expel the Interlopers is pretty similar, where we can play this in like a white kind of mid-rangey deck with mostly like 2/2s that draw a card or things like that to enter the battlefield and have some little micro advantage. And then we use Expel the Interlopers as our sweeper effect that just clears anything that's bigger than our stuff. And this is like a very sought after effect we've had in the past. There was I can't think of the name of it, but it was 3 and 2 white for you choose an artifact, enchantment, creature, whatever, and the opponent sacrifices the rest. And it was such a blowout because you got to essentially dictate the permanents that were left on either side of the table. And with Expel the Interlopers, it's going to be pretty similar, where you can use it and blow up your own thing, but most of the time you're just going to blow up only your opponent's stuff, and it's going to be one heck of a beating. Yes, Tragic Arrogance is the card I was thinking of. And Expel the Interlopers is going to be similar in that you just get to control when it's cast and how detrimental it is to the opponent and how detrimental it is to you. Next up, Extraordinary Journey. Blue, and 2X. Whenever Extraordinary Journey enters the battlefield, exile up to X target creatures. For each of those cards, its owner may play it for as long as it remains exiled. Whenever one or more non-token creatures enters the battlefield, if one or more of them entered from exile or was cast from exile, you draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. A very strange one. Doesn't say under your opponent's control. So that means you can play this for blue, and then all your adventure cards draw a card. So in that way, you can kind of treat it like an Edgewall Innkeeper. You can use it to slow down your opponent's stuff for 4 and 6 mana. And they can cast it, but it's going to be a little difficult. But when they do recast it, you get to draw a card. This is a really weird one. I have no idea if it's going to be playable or not. I assume not. But blue means that this could be played alongside Nykthos in a devotion strategy. And this might be good if there's like a blue X devotion adventure strategy where you basically get it from both ends, where you get to interact with your opponent, draw cards when they play stuff, and draw cards when you play stuff from exile. Overall, I think it's a little too expensive. I would have liked to have seen that pushed a little harder. Next up, for 6 mana, you get Fairy Slumber Party. It's a sorcery. It says return all creatures to their owner's hands. For each opponent who controlled a creature returned in this way, you create 2 1/1 fairy tokens with flying, and this creature can block only creatures with flying. This card's pretty sweet. It's a big bounce effect. You get 2 1/1s if your opponent had anything, and in Commander, it's going to be ridiculous because you get, up to 6 tokens, and then you can leverage those tokens however you want via Ashnod's Altar, things like that. Very cool card. I doubt I'll see it play constructed. We have a lot of effects very similar to this already that don't see any play, including one that makes an 8/8 Kraken and hits all non-land permanents, as opposed to this that only hits creatures. Farsight Ritual, 2 and 2 blue for an instant with bargain. So if you sack an artifact, an enchantment, or a token as you cast it, it gets juiced up. It says look at the top 4 cards of your library. If this spell was bargain, look at the top 8 cards of this library instead. Put 2 of them in your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So essentially, dig through time. This is very similar to Memory Deluge. It will be the standard staple that Memory Deluge is once Deluge is gone. But for now, I don't think it'll take the place of it. I think it's not quite different enough and not quite exciting enough to warrant over Memory Deluge on basically any deck that plays it. Next up, Faustbane Troll. 2 green-black for a 4/4. When it enters the battlefield, create a monster roll token attached to it. So it comes in as a 5/5 with trample. Monster means +1/+1 and trample. And then for 1, you may sack an aura attached to it. It fights target creature you don't control. If that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. Activate only as a sorcery. So a built-in fight. Faustbane Troll looks incredible. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. 4 mana 5/5 that you can spend 1, remove a +1/+1 from it, and fight something as a 4/4. Very, very good in a lot of different strategies. This is a very desirable card for Golgari midrange, and I look forward to playing it quite a bit. It's competing with Collected Company, so I would think you're probably going to see this in a deck very similar to Rakdos midrange, but going Golgari instead, and then perhaps using things like Abrupt Decay to bridge in the mid game. I think Faustbane Troll is very strong, and I doubt that it'll replace Shieldred, but it might supplement Shieldred. Next up is Feral Encounter. This is a very complicated one, so I'll do my best to grok it. Green for sorcery. It says look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may exile a creature card from among them. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may cast the exiled card this turn. At the beginning of your next combat phase this turn, target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to up to 1 target creature you don't control. There's too much going on this card. I'm sorry. I don't care how good this card is. It's too many words. It's too complicated to really matter. You're looking at cards, you're exiling cards, you can play the card, and then you also get a delayed fight or bite. I don't know. I'm just going to skip. A lot going on. I doubt that it'll see play. It looks very complicated. And not a whole lot of good payoff, if you ask me. All right. Next up, Foodfight. Red and 1. This one looks interesting. For an enchantment, artifacts you control have 2. Sack this artifact. It deals damage to any target equal to 1 plus the number of permanents named Foodfight you control. Okay, so for 2, you can sack a treasure and deal 2 to something, because it's 1 plus the number of permanents named Foodfight you control. So you sack a treasure, you sack a blood. This is going to be very good in Rakdos Sacrifice if there is more of an emphasis on blood tokens, but we already have Epicure, Blood Tithe Harvester, and Deadly Dispute, all that generate those tokens that are desirable for Foodfight. And we can really lean into it, with the Cauldron with Cat Oven. Instead of bringing back Cat, sometimes we can use that food token to blow up an opponent's creature. We can also use it to deal damage to any target, so we can use it to finish off our opponent when we get down to the late game. I think Foodfight's excellent. This is a card that I'd be terrified to play against in a competitive setting, because I know that when my opponent plays this, their whole deck is going to be focused around using that mana to just throw damage at my stuff and ultimately at my face once they gain control of the battlefield. Very cool card. It's Foodfight. It's decent in multiples too, because each one lets each artifact deal an extra damage. I like this card a lot. I think it's quite good. Next up is Godric Cloaked Reveler. For a 2 red and 1, you get a 3/3. Haste says as long as 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn, Godric Cloaked Reveler is a dragon with base fire toughness 4/4, flying, and fire breathing. So, long story short, you play this. It doesn't say 2 or more non-land permanents that other than this. So if you play this into Burning Tree Emissary, Burning Tree Emissary into Godric, you're gaining a really big boost of damage. Excuse me. And personally, I'm very excited by this card. So Godric Cloaked Reveler, really interested to try this out in a number of Burning Tree red decks. I think that's definitely the type of deck. Maybe you play the Ornithopter artifact package with Gleeful Demolition, and then you get a bunch of non-land permanents entering the battlefield to turn on Godric while it's already in play, or to enable it so you can cast it on the same turn. You do those things. With Convoke cards, and free spells like Ornithopter, I think Godric Cloak Reveler is going to be a nice top end to the Boros Convoke deck that we saw, just a few months back at the regional championship in Dallas. So very cool card. I think the celebration mechanic is going to be a little hard to turn on, but I'm excited to see who can turn it on the easiest while getting the most from it. Next up, Gruff Triplets, 3 and 3 green for a 3/3 trample. When it enters the battlefield, if it isn't a token, create 2 tokens that are copies of it. When Gruff Triplets dies, put a number of 1/1 counters equal to its power on each creature you control named Gruff Triplets. This card reminds me a little bit of Sapperling Burst. For those of you who've been playing for a long time, Sapperling Burst was an enchantment out of Nemesis that came in with 7 fading counters. You could remove a counter from it to make an XX equal to the fading counters on it. So on the first turn, you made a 6/6, but then it would reduce to a 5/5, then a 4/4, yada yada. But you could make more than one creature at once, and those creatures, if you gave them haste via Fires of Yavimaya, another card that was really good back then, you could attack your opponent with large swaths of damage. Gruff Triplets works very similarly to that. If your opponent goes to clear one of the tokens, the other 2 grow to 6/6, and when you clear one of those, the other one grows to 12/12. So, I think that this is the type of card that's going to be difficult to beat outside of a sweeper effect, and I'll be very interested to see how it performs in constructed, because 6 is a hefty ask. In limited, I think it's going to be incredible, and in commander, it's going to be a lot of fun. So excited about Gruff Triplets. It's a cool card. Next up, Gumdrop Poisoner. This is one that I quite like, but it'll be a little hard to get going. For 3 mana, you get a 3/2 lifelink, Human Warlock. And then when Gumdrop Poisoner enters the battlefield, up to 1 target creature gets -X/-X till end of turn, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn. And then it has Adventure, Tempt with Treats, 1 black instant, create a food token. So a nice little way to generate a token for 1 on top of a 3/2 with a potentially good ability. This works nicely alongside things like Gifted Etherborn, which have lifelink, so you can attack with them on turn 2, and then Gumdrop Poisoner another creature if they don't trade or block. It also has lifelink itself, so future iterations of itself can turn on, or current iterations can turn on future iterations just by attacking. And then ultimately, you just want to find static ways like Cat Oven to gain some life so that it can consistently give -1/-1 to things like Llanowar Elves and other cheap creatures. So really interested in Gumdrop Poisoner. I think that this is one that we're going to get some good value out of. Why no stream lately, says Malachi. Well, I've been focusing a lot on YouTube stuff for my other channel, Malachi. We're working on Lorcana stuff. So let me link you to that. If you're interested in Disney's Lorcana, that's basically where all my work time has been going in lately. I still been writing articles about Magic for my Patreon. You can check out my Patreon as well if you're interested in reading all about my exploits. And yeah, but mostly streaming is just a way for me to advertise for my other projects. I don't actually get very much money from Twitch, and streaming 20 times a month does not increase my revenue very much at all from Twitch. And so I've been streaming when I want to stream. I've been streaming when new decks come out, but we haven't had a new set for Pioneer in 3 months. And so I've been really focusing on other stuff. And Lorcana has been a really fun project that I'm very excited about. Next up, Heart Flame Duelist. This is a white and 1 for a 3/1. Human Knight. Instant and sorcery spells you control have lifelink. That's pretty cool. very similar to Soulfire Grandmaster. And then as a adventure for 2 and a red instant, Heart Flame Slash deals 3 damage to any target. This is a home run. This card is incredible. This will be a 4 of in every red white deck that's not token themed. Like any aggressive strategy that's white creatures with some burn spells, red and white creatures with anything. This card is sick. Absolutely sick. You know, it is a human as well. That's a good call, Mini Pet. And so maybe a human deck has the ability to interact on like an extra card, right? Maybe instead of mono white humans, it's white red humans, and you just splash red just for Heartflame Slash on the back of Sacred Foundry and like 4 Pathway, and otherwise it's just a 2 mana 3/1 human, you know, something like that. But I think it's going to be more strong in decks featuring, you know, Bone Crusher Giant or Wild Slash type things like Play with Fire, you know, burn spells. You want to play this with burn spells, but the burn spells in Pioneer are actually quite weak. This would obviously be a home run in somewhere like Modern, if it's good in Modern, like if it's efficient enough and playable enough for Modern, because it pairs with Lightning Bolt pretty nicely, right? But yeah, this card is great. I absolutely adore this card. Very excited to try it out in a number of decks. This could also be a really cool card in something like Jeskai midrange or red white like midrange or control-y, where you want a bunch of things like Bone Crusher Giant and your removal is burn oriented, like not Lava Coil, but the new one that they made. This basically Lava Coil that can hit Planeswalkers. You know, this card with Rose seems cool, killing things that have 5 toughness and gaining 5 life. And then itself, just the Heart Flame Slash being a removal spell, it is very similar to Bone Crusher Giant, but it just kind of goes in reverse. One of the strengths of Bone Crusher is that it allows you to curve 2 for Stomp into 3 for Bone Crusher Giant, and I think that that's pretty sick. Very excited about this one. Next up, Horn Lockwell. This is basically the Loch Ness Monster. For 6 mana, you get a 6/6 whale with Flash and Ward 2, and it says it enters the battlefield tapped unless it's your turn. So you can't use it to ambush your opponent's creatures, but you can play it on their end step. You can also main phase it if you need a blocker for next turn. It also has an ability for adventure called Lagoon Breach for a blue 1. It says the owner of target attacking creature you don't control puts it on top or bottom of their library. So if your opponent's attacking you, Hornlock Whale banishes it, and they choose top or bottom, very much like Ether Gust. That's removal. That's Azorius Charm. This card's great. This is a split card that acts as a flash threat that can kill your opponent easily with Ward 2. I think that this is going to be a nice control finisher for a lot of decks. And this could be something that you see in like blue-white control, for example, that pairs nicely with like Shark Typhoon and other flash threats, while also just being an answer. And we saw like Bone Crusher Giant doing 2 damage with Stomp. It's not the most efficient removal spell that you can ask for 2 mana, only dealing 2 damage. And Hornlockwell, similarly, you're not going to be able to knock off a Llanowar Elves with it, but at the moment your opponent attacks you, you can banish that creature to the top or bottom of their library based on where they want to put it. But often that's good enough to just buy you enough time to start playing your later game spells. Hornlockwell is probably going to go more in a blue-black flash deck or a blue-black control deck rather than a blue-white deck. I think the white already having Wandering Emperor, Settle the Wreckage, things like that, means that your opponent's going to be able to play around them quite easily most of the time. But Hornlockwell seems perfect for like a blue-black control deck. This card's awesome. And I love the theme, you know, because it's basically the Loch Ness Monster. Hilda's Crown of Winter. We saw Hilda earlier. For 3 mana, you get a legendary artifact that says 1 tap. Tap target creature. This ability costs 1 less to activate during your turn. That's kind of cool. You can use this with Hilda to draw cards or make 4/4s or whatever. And then you can spend 3 and sack it to draw a card for each tapped creature your opponents control. Interesting. So this can essentially be a big windfall of resources if your opponent is being aggressive. It's kind of expensive, though. I don't think this card's going to see that much play, but it's certainly cool. And we talked a little bit about Icy Manipulator earlier, and while Icy can tap lands or whatever, Hilda's Crown of Winter can only tap creatures, but has multiple other abilities that are kind of interesting. Next up, Imidane the Pyro Hammer. This is a 4 mana 4/4. Whenever an instant or sorcery spell you control that targets only a single creature deals damage to that creature, Imidane deals that much damage to each opponent. So basically, you deal shock to a creature, each opponent takes 2. Everything turns into Searing Blaze. Very cool card. Nice top end. It's got a lot of competition in the 4-drop slot, though. I doubt it'll see play in Pioneer, but this might be something really nice for Standard. Plus, her arms are cool. They're like made of stone or something. Next up, Ingenious Prodigy. I think this card's great. Blue and X for an 0/1 human wizard. Has Skulk. This creature can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. So the smaller it is, the harder it is to block. And it says it enters the battlefield with X 1/1 counters on it. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if Ingenious Prodigy has one or more counters on it, you may remove a 1/1 counter from it. If you do, draw a card. So you can keep this being big. You can play this small. You can play it as a 2/2, draw a card, attack for 1. Next turn, you can draw another card to keep it as a 1/1 unblockable. A lot of different ways to play this card. Later in the game, you're going to play it as a big expel and just use it as a card draw engine. But it can be played at many different spots, and the body will stick around for a while, so you can use it to sacrifice to things like Deadly Dispute. There's a lot to love about Ingenious Prodigy. I don't know exactly where it's going to go, but it's a really cool card, and I am curious to see where it does go. Next up, Lady of Laughter, 3 and 2 white for a Fairy Noble, 4/5 flyer with Celebration. At the beginning of your end step, 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn. Draw a card. I think Celebration is pretty hard to turn on outside of red tokens, things like that. I wouldn't be surprised if cards like this are just completely unplayable and only good for limited. With that said, I think that if this were like a 3/4 flyer, this could be an uncommon. It's very close to being an uncommon, so much so that I think you can maybe even make it an uncommon and it would still be about the same. I come to SEG Columbus. I'm not planning to, but I have been known to change my mind last minute. Next up, the card that I love, Lich King's Conquest. For 5 mana, you get a sorcery that says, sack any number of artifacts, enchantments, or tokens. Return that many creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. This reminds me a lot of Command the Dreadhorde, which was very powerful when it was in Standard. Had some nice little combos to it. And Lich Knight's Conquest is maybe a little more difficult to turn on, but it's a full mana cheaper, and it works nicely with blood tokens for 2 reasons. You can use it to blood tokens to discard big creatures from hand, and then later you can use extra blood tokens to sacrifice to bring a bunch of big stuff back. I think Lich Knight's Conquest is going to be great in like a self-mill strategy, but you have to make sure that your self-mill stuff is potentially generating things to sacrifice with the ability. So this might be one of those where it's more complicated than it looks on paper, but I just love the idea of this card. I think it's quite cool. Escape shift for creatures. If it was sack creatures, it would be, but it's tokens. So you need to play things that generate artifacts, enchantments, or tokens, and put stuff into the graveyard. It might be a tall order, but you can use it with Stern Lesson, and that can make a Power Stone token, stuff like that. Next up is Likeness Looter. Interesting. I haven't seen this card yet. Black and blue for a 1/1 fairy shapeshifter, flying. Tap, draw a card, then discard a card. Already very excited about it. X. Likeness Looter becomes a copy of target creature card in your graveyard with mana value X, except it has flying and this ability. Activate only as a sorcery. This is a very sweet card. Likeness Looter is very similar to Lazav, the Multifarious, which we play a decent amount in decks featuring Mox Amber because it's a legendary. So we won't be able to put Likeness Looter into those types of decks. But what we can do is use Likeness Looter with creatures that are maybe hard to cast from hand, loot them into the graveyard, and then use Likeness Looter to become copies of them. This is more of one of those cards that's going to be great once you have access to just like a giant pool of creatures, and so it can become more things. I'm thinking maybe this becomes like a Rowan or something like that, where you can use it to reduce the cost of stuff and get more redundancy with cards like Rowan. And you can leave Rowan in your graveyard instead of having to cast it. With that said, this card's pretty sweet. It's hard to quantify exactly what it's going to do to a game, but for 2 mana, a 1/1 flyer that loots already above board on rate. I like this card a lot. Like it for Legacy and Dreadnought. That sounds awesome too. Next up, Lord Skittering's Blessing. Black and 1 for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, create a Wicked Roll token and attach it to target creature you control. The Wicked Roll is when the aura is put into a graveyard, each opponent loses 1 life. At the beginning of your draw step, if you control an enchanted creature, you lose 1 life and you draw an additional card. Okay. Pretty interesting card. I doubt it'll see much constructed play, but this type of Phyrexian Arena effect, for one more mana, you get all the same stuff without all the bells and whistles. But if you are an aggressive deck that plays a lot of one drops, you're going to want to play this on 2, put a 1/1 counter on it during your end step, you draw a card. It replaces itself immediately. So I can definitely see this being fuel in a really aggressive deck, and maybe good with the rat tokens off of the next card, Lord Skitter Sewer King. So Lord Skitter Sewer King's 2 and a black for a 3/3 legendary rat noble. Says whenever another rat enters the battlefield under your control, exile up to 1 target card from an opponent's graveyard. Beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 black rat creature token with this creature can't block. And so you're going to be able to create an army of rat tokens over the first few turns while it's in play. You get a rat token immediately at the beginning of combat, very similar to Goblin Rabble Master. I like that it has 3 toughness so that it dodges stomp, another 2 damage removal. And I like that when your rat comes into play at the beginning of combat, you can exile something from your opponent's graveyard immediately. So a lot to love about Lord Skitter, Sewer King. Reminds me a lot of Graveyard Trespasser, but maybe a bigger punish for not interacting with it. Whereas Graveyard Trespasser is like, if you interact with it, you get mega punished. But this is like, you have to deal with it now or you're in trouble. I like Lord Skitter quite a bit. Would like to see maybe Mono Black aggro make a return. Next up, Malevolent Witchkite, 6 mana flyer, Dragon Warlock. Says whenever it enters the battlefield, sack any number of artifacts, enchantments, or tokens, and draw that many cards. I believe this card is pretty sweet. It's a big draw effect for all of your extra artifacts, enchantments, and tokens that you can sacrifice. Maybe this is a better top end than Corvold, the Fakehurst King. In a sacrifice deck, since it's only 1 color, you don't have to play it in Jund. You can just play it in Rakdos as the top end. But I think doing that is unnecessary, and I think that this card is unlikely to see play outside of Commander, though I think it is quite good. Next up, Mosswood Dread Knight, green and 1 for a 3/2 trample, human knight. Says when Mosswood Dread Knight dies, you may cast it from your graveyard as an adventure until the end of your next turn. And then the adventure is Dread Whispers, black and 1 sorcery. You draw a card and you lose 1 life. So basically, Mosswood Dread Knight says whenever this dies, you can cast Dread Whispers from the graveyard, and that allows you to cast Mosswood Dread Knight again. And it lasts until the end of your next turn. So even if it dies on your own turn, it's not going to go away until the next turn. You're going to see this card be very strong in things like Priest of Forgotten Gods decks. I already wrote a whole sideboard guide and article about the new Tyvar Sacrifice deck I've been working on. And we feature 4 copies of Mosswood Dread Knight. So if you're interested in that archetype in this card, make sure to check out the Patreon. It's $5 to join. It's how I help pay most of my bills. So make sure to check it out. Patreon.com/Tandy. Great card, though. Very excited about it. Next up, we'll go for Ogre Chitterlord. For 6 mana, you get a 6/5 Ogre Warrior with Menace. And then it enters the battlefield. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, create 2 rat tokens that can't block. If you control 5 or more rats, each rat you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Very like Grave Titan-esque, right? Big creature enters the battlefield. If left unchecked or paired with a bunch of other rats, those rats can become extremely powerful. All you need to do when you play this, when you get to combat on the next turn, when you attack with it, you're going to get 2 more. So really, you'll need to be able to make 1 rat token outside of the Ogre Chitterlord in order to give all your rats +2/+0. I could see this at the top end of like a rat mid-range deck. I think that's more of like a standard deck than it is a pioneer deck. But Ogre Chitterlord is certainly really sweet. And I could maybe even see this being a Grave Titan type effect in a Reanimator deck that uses what's it called? Lich Knight's Conquest, right? Because we can sack tokens to that. So maybe Ogre Chitterlord becomes a nice top-end effect that we can cast or return with, the Lich Knight's Conquest. But Chitterlord just seems really powerful in general. 6 mana is a lot, but you get some stuff for it. The fact that it's so similar to the Titan cycle is pretty interesting, though. Next up, Pollen Shield Hair. This is one I'm very excited about. So it's a 2-cost, 2/2. Says creature tokens you control get +1/+1. And then the adventure half of it is green for hair raising. Target creature you control gains vigilance and gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. So basically, when you already have a big setup, you can go green to give something a big buff and can potentially burst kill someone, especially if that creature has trample or evasion of some kind, like an ornithopter. And then it says creature tokens you control get +1/+1. This is going to be great for decks like Boros Convoke that are very interested in making a lot of creature tokens, especially with the Gleeful Demolition. It's going to be nice there. I'm going to want it with a lot more token generation, and I'm going to want Hair Raising to be a freebie cast off of lands like Copperline Gorge or Razor Verge Thicket, maybe Temple Garden Stomping Ground. And I think it's going to be great. Just that extra burst damage potential. Pumping your tokens gives you an extra dimension. I think this card's really cool. I'm interested to see how it plays. Might help bring green-white tokens back as well. Next up is one that I think we'll see a lot of play. It's Questing Druid. This is the green and 1 human druid, the 1/1. Whenever you cast a spell that's white, blue, black, or red, put a +1/+1 counter on Questing Druid. This is a card that we've seen before in Magic, just without the adventure, and it's called Quirion Dryad. Quirion Dryad was exactly the same text, except it was a Dryad instead of a Druid, and it wasn't a human. And ultimately, what ended up happening was it basically just got outdated. But back when you were playing Opt and other cantrips in Standard, Brainstorm was legal around that same time. You got decks featuring Quirion Dryad that were quite strong. And ultimately, though, Questing Druid is just a natural upgrade for that creature who's no longer viable. It was reprinted in Standard about 10 years ago, saw virtually no play. So I think it's time we got a nice little upgrade. Questing Druid, the adventure side says Seek the Beast. Red and 1 for an instant. Exile the top 2 cards of your library. Until your next end step, you may play those cards. So until your next end step. So it's also an instant. You can play it on your own turn, but then they'll disappear during the end step. You play them during your own end step or on your opponent's turn. You have until your turn, the end of your turn, to play them. I think that this is a nice little bottle type card that you see with Rin's Resolve and the other one that we see a lot in Boros Pia. And maybe Boros Pia ends up becoming Naya Pia, so we play Questing Druid. And I think that seems almost free because Seek the Beast is very similar to the bottle cards that we already play in that archetype. As long as we time it right. Being an instant versus sorcery is a big deal, so that we can kind of play around our own effects. But I think Questing Druid in general is just a strong card. I wouldn't even be surprised to see full-blown Naya Pia become a real thing. I'll just have to wait and see how good Questing Druid is. But Questing Druid getting, if it's the only green card in your deck, it gets pumped by Chain of the Rocks. It gets pumped by all of your card draw effects, all of your bottle draws. Soulscar Mage. These are all things that put +1/+1 counters on Questing Druid. So as long as your mana base is functional enough with things like Mana Confluence, you can play Questing Druid as a 2-drop in a lot of matchups and then just like pump the crap out of it on the next turn. And it has like, pseudo prowess, but it triggers on anything. And maybe that's something with the Seek the Beast where it just is a natural fit to Boros Pia and it just completely changes the archetype. All right. I'm a busy man these days, chat. Feels good to be busy. All right, here we go. Next up is Raging Battle Mouse. For red and 1, we get a 2/1 mouse. The second spell you cast each turn costs 1 less to cast. Has Celebration, so the Burning Tree Clause. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn, target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So you can play this on turn 3 and then a 1-mana spell to follow it. And then you can give a +1/+1 boost to another creature. I think this is a perfect pairing for Burning Tree Emissary. I think this card is excellent. It's going to be great with things like Bone Crusher Giant, which can allow us to go turn 3, we go Raging Battle Mouse plus Stomp with the reduction, maybe Lightning Strike or something like that. But mostly you just want a high raw number of cards to be able to play. And all the adventure cards work really well when you're trying to double spell for Celebration. So yeah, I think this card's awesome. Very much looking forward to how this works. Maybe even in Boros Convoke. Making your Convoke card cost 1 less by casting this seems awesome. I'm just really excited about the Celebration mechanic in general. Next up is Rankles Prankles. Once you pop, you can't stop. 2 black and 2 for sorcery. It says choose 1 or more. Each player discards 2 cards. Each player loses 4 life. Each player sacrifices 2 creatures. Very similar abilities to Rankle Master of Pranks. but it's essentially doubled. 2 card discarded, 2 creature sacrificed, 4 life lost instead of 2. But you get it. Long story short, this is going to be great for any deck that already wanted something like Barter and Blood, which has seen play in Standard in the past. This card takes that and turns it up to 11. Each player discarding 2 cards is optional, but if you're empty-handed or close to it, or you have a heavy graveyard theme and you know your opponent is a control deck or a deck that needs all of his resources, it's going to be excellent. Each player loses 4 life. You're going to use that usually to just kill your opponent in a couple chunks when you have a life advantage on them. And then each player sack 2 creatures, usually just doing this when you have no creatures in play, as a big hammer for any deck that plays a lot of threats. I think this card's awesome. Truly awesome card. Next up, Red Cap Gutter Dweller. 2 and 2 red for a 3/3 goblin with menace. When it enters the battlefield, create 2 rats. They can't block. That's already a great start. 4 mana 3/3 that makes 2 1/1s that can't block. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may sacrifice another creature, so you can sack a rat. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on a Red Cap Gutter Dweller and exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. So this is like a self-sustaining card draw engine and battlefield generator, and it's all optional. This card will revolutionize how decks are built in Standard in red aggressive strategies, and I think that this card is maybe good enough for Pioneer. This card is crazy. I've never seen this card before until just now. Everything about it screams playable and good, and I think this card is going to see play in Pioneer. We'll see, though. The types of red decks that are seeing play right now are often token based or very spell dense with Reckless Impulse and the like. All right, next up, Regal Bunnycorn, maybe the cutest thing that's ever been created in Magic the Gathering. 1 and a white for a star. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of non-land permanents you control. This is another absolutely stellar addition to Boros Convoke. This is an enormous creature for 2 mana. And it's only a 1/1 when you cast it. It's not other. It counts itself, so it's a base 1/1. But for every token you produce, for every, I'm immediately putting this into the non-Burning Tree version of Boros Convoke, and I think it's going to just be stellar. Imagine casting this on the same turn you cast Reckless Bushwhacker when you hit 4 mana and just murdering your opponent from 0, right? And Regal Bunnycorn just allows you to do that by paying off any non-land permanent, not just creature tokens. So your opponent can wrath you, but then all your clue tokens and your blood tokens. And then, if you're able to play an Ornithopter somewhere in there, Bunnycorn is just going to be an enormous threat. And it makes perfect sense to me why it's rare. And I think it's going to be significantly better than its cuteness really showcases. So get ready to be getting whipped by this beautiful creature in the coming months. Next up is Restless Bivouac. This is part of the enters the battlefield tap cycle of dual lands that can turn into creatures. Taps for red and white. For 1 red-white, it becomes a 2/2 red and white ox creature until end of turn. It's still a land. Whenever this attacks, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So this is very similar to Raging Ravine, but you can move the counters around, and it's extremely cheap to activate. Now, this is going to go more in like a mid-range red-white deck because the land enters tapped. I don't see this overtaking things like Den of the Bugbear in the aggressive decks, but the slower your deck is, the better this land is going to be. And I would probably think you're going to see this in decks that play like Bone Crusher Giant, but are leaning white instead of black. And people might do that in order to play things like Chain to the Rocks, since Chain to the Rocks is a pretty great removal spell right now, and other white cards maybe that are coming out of the new set. So the creature lands all seem pretty good, and I'm excited. I'm curious to see how they impact the format. They're all Restless something or another, so let's just do them all now. Next up, Restless Cottage. Enters taps for black or green. For 4, you get a 4/4 black and green horror creature token. It's still land, and then whenever it attacks, you create a food and exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. So this card is very similar to Hive of the Eye Tyrant, but it's a dual land. It also enters tapped and is slightly bigger. And it also creates a food token. So there's a lot to love about Restless Cottage, and the alternate art on it is terrifying. Just maybe the scariest amalgamation I've ever seen in my whole life. A gingerbread house with candy cane legs chasing you down and eating you instead of you eating it. Nightmare fuel. Next up, Restless Fortress. This is black and white. Enters taps for black or white. 4 mana, becomes a 1/4 white and black nightmare until end of turn. It's still land. Whenever it attacks, defending player loses 2 and you gain 2 life. This is a nice little racing land. For 4, I have to wait and see if it's any good. It seems difficult to block. Seems nice for chip damage later in the game and attrition heavy matchups. But creature lands often gain a lot of strength from being able to pressure an opposing planeswalker. Control decks that go planeswalker into Supreme Verdict or similar sweeper effect often leave creature-based decks with an inability to pressure those planeswalkers. And Mutavault, Den of the Bugbear, these are all great ways to do that. Restless Fortress is not that. So I think this is probably going to end up being the worst of the bunch, but we'll have to wait and see. Restless Spire. Enters tapped. Taps for blue or red. Blue red turns into a 2/1 elemental. And as long as it's your turn, this creature has first strike. Whenever it attacks, scry 1. This is a really aggressive creature land. This reminds me a lot of Fairy Conclave. It doesn't have evasion. But the scry 1 could be good for finding burn spells to finish your opponent off. Basically, just when you have extra mana lying around, you can use this. Very curious to see what this goes in and how it performs. It's small and it doesn't have evasion, but it's very cheap to activate. If you can clear your opponent's creatures, it's going to be pretty good. And lastly, Restless Vinestalk. This is my pick for best one, but we'll talk about it. So enters tap, taps for green blue. For 5, it becomes a 5/5 plant with trample. That's a big deal, has trample. And then when it attacks, up to one other target creature has base power, toughness 3/3 till end of turn. You can use that aggressively or defensively. Make your opponent's thing a 3/3 that's trying to block it. Make your 1/1 into a 3/3 so you do extra damage. This card is enormous and hits very hard. And green and blue is definitely a type of deck that can utilize creature lands because they have an emphasis on ramping. And so when you get to the late game for Restless Vinestalk, you're just going to have the ability to use your mana and pressure your opponent with that 5/5 and the extra ability. All right. Very cool land cycle. I'm curious how they impact Pioneer. I have no idea how they'll go just yet. Next up, Rotisserie Elemental. I'm already pretty hungry. This is making me hungrier. 1 mana, 1/1 with Menace. Elemental. Says when it deals combat damage to a player, put a skewer counter on it. Then you may sack it. If you do, exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of skewer counters on it. You may play those cards this turn. So very similar to Bomat Courier that we had in Standard a while back. It doesn't have haste to start, so it's a little bit underwhelming in that vein. But you can do a lot worse than a red version of Bomat Courier. The fact that it has Menace means it can be difficult to block sometimes. And once you get to 2 or 3, like, you get to keep all the cards in your hand, and you get a, like we've been talking about, it's another bottle effect where you can attack, sack it, and then until the end turn, you can play those cards. So it's kind of like a 1/1 version of like a light up the stage. It takes a little bit to get going, but once you get it going, you get essentially to cast it for free and then use those cards just by sacking the Rotisserie Elemental. This is something I'm really wanting to try in a very aggressive burn heavy red deck. Things like Skewer the Critic seem like they go really nicely with the Rotisserie Elemental. Light of the Stage also seems like it goes good with the Rotisserie Elemental. This card is kind of like Bomat Courier, but with evasion, and reminds me a lot of, what's it called? The Phoenix that comes back if you attack with 3 creatures. I don't know. It's only like a year old. That Phoenix reminds me a lot of that. Next up, Scalding Viper. Red 1 for a 2/1. Elemental Snake says whenever an opponent casts a spell with mana value 3 or less, Scalding Viper deals 1 damage to that player. So very similar to Eidolon the Great Revel. It's a Punisher mechanic, but it also has Steam Clean as a sorcery, a blue and 1. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Wow. This card is basically a red version of Brazen Borrower. This card looks nice. I am very excited to try this card out in a blue-red base aggressive strategy. Yeah, this card looks so sick. All right, cool. Next up, Sentinel of Lost Lore. 2 green and 1 for a 3/4 Elf Knight. When Sentinel of Lost Lore enters the battlefield, choose 1 or more. Return target card you own in exile that has an adventure to your hand. Put target card you don't own in exile that has an adventure on the bottom of its owner's library. Exile target player's graveyard. So for 3, you get a 3/4 to let you return an adventure from your graveyard to your hand. You can bench an opposing adventure card that is already in exile, or you can eat your opponent's graveyard. So a lot of things to like about Sentinel of Lost Lore. I think the effect it has on the game is relatively weak, all things considered, but it can be good. And a 3 mana 3/4 that eats your opponent's graveyard is nothing to sneeze at. We had a 3/2 that essentially did the same thing that was playable in multiple formats for a long time. This card's pretty cool. The adventure stuff, it's central to the Eldraine theme, and it can be nice against things like Bone Crusher Giant, or if your opponent has another adventure card in their deck. But this is a nice counter for that to get rid of half the body. But it also has extra text for eating graveyards. I doubt I'll see a ton of constructed play, but it's kind of cool. Next up, Sleep Curse Fae. 1 for a 3/3 flyer, so it's got to have a huge drawback, right? Flying in Ward 2. It says, enters the battlefield tapped with 3 stun counters on it. If it would become untapped, remove a stun counter from it instead. You may send a balloon 1 to untap it, aka remove a stun counter. This thing seems like it's a little too hard to get online, but it's something you can play early and kind of wait on it to unlock. This is a mechanic you see in other games quite a bit. I think in Magic, you really want 1-mana cards so you can leverage interaction like cheap counter spells on turns 2, 3, and 4. I don't think that this is a big enough threat once it's unlocked to do that, and I don't think using a balloon 1 to remove a stun counter on it does enough. I like that it has Ward 2. I would be very, very surprised if this ends up doing anything in any format. But with that said, this is the type of card that players love to try to break because it's so undercosted, and it just requires a little bit of finesse to really get going. I just think that the 3 stun counters on it is a little too much. 2 stun counters on it might be too much. But maybe not with the with the untap. If it was 2 counters, you could play it. On the next turn, it would remove 1 down to 1, and then on your turn 2, you can remove 1, and then on turn 3, it's ready to start attacking. I think that would be a much better play pattern for this card and more balance. But the way that it sits now, it's more of like a 5-cost card that you can start with on turn 1, and it just takes forever to get going. Now, if this was like a 1/1 that's made a once you remove all the stun counters, maybe it started making 1/1s itself, like a Bitter Blossom, like an engine card that you could play early and then have it do some, like once you got to untap with it, if it really paid off and punished the opponent, I think this type of card could be cool. And this ability is something that I'd love to see them explore in the future. Kind of like, it's asleep for a few turns. All right, next up, Song of Totentanz, a red and X for sorcery. Create X/1/1 rat tokens with this creature can't block. Creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. So at the base, this is a red to give all your creatures haste until end of turn. That is better than some instance of sorceries that I've seen in the past, whose sole thing was giving something haste for 1. This, for 2, you get a rat, and that rat gains haste, and everything else gains haste. I think that this type of card is really cool. You could see this in like a Boros Tokens or Boros Convoke type deal. Maybe Rakdos rat theme with the big 6-drop that we talked about earlier. Where's he at? Ogre Chitter Lord, use it with Lord Skitter, Sewer King. These are all ways that we can use Song of Totentanz. And then when we get to 7, 8, 9 mana, this is just a big fireball, right? You just make a bunch of rats and throw them at your opponent's face. Exactly the kind of thing I would expect from a rat deck, using those rats as fodder. Next up, Spectre of Mortality, 3 and 2 black for a 3/3 Spectre. Has flying, and then when it enters the battlefield, you may exile 1 or more creature cards from your graveyard. When you do, each other creature gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the number of cards exiled this way. So this, don't get this wrong, this is a sweeper effect. This is Massacre Girl 2.0. This is a 3/3 flyer for 5 that kills every other thing on the table as long as you have some cards in your graveyard. And I think that this is going to be incredible and limited and pretty good in constructed standard, and maybe viable in Pioneer as the top end of some mid-range decks that just really want a sweeper effect that's controllable. Big fan of Spectre Mortality. Next up, Spellbook Vendor, 1 and 1 for a 2/2 Vig Human Peasants. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may pay 1. When you do, create a Sorcerer Roll token attached to target creature you control. I believe Sorcerer Roll is the first time we've seen it. If you control another roll, put that one in the graveyard. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has, whenever this creature attacks, scry 1. So essentially, every turn you can spend 1, and you can put a roll counter on something that doesn't have a roll on it, and then it'll get a 1/1 from the buff, and then it'll have a scry 1 whenever it attacks. Very cool card to Spellbook Vendor. A nice little way to generate, tokens for bargain. We get raw permanents, which is nice, and I like it. I don't know, it looks cool. Low impact, but interesting, especially inside the mechanic roll tokens. All right, next up, Spiteful Hexmage. 1 black for a 3/2 human warlock. Says when it enters the battlefield, create a curse roll token attached to target creature you control. So if this is the only thing you play on turn 1, that creature will become a 1/1. It's kind of like a spell that's backfiring or whatever. But the goal of this card is essentially play it with a 0 mana creature on 1 or another 1 mana creature on turn 2. And you're hoping that drawback turning into a 1/1 is not that big of a deal because the creature doesn't lose all abilities. It just is cursed and becomes a 1/1, but it maintains those abilities. So you can use this on anything that can be sacrificed, anything that's fodder for the rest of your stuff, while having a pretty aggressive 3/2 in the mix. Unfortunately, I don't think this one's going to be very good in competitive play, but it's certainly interesting, and it's a nice little nod to just like who will never amount to anything now, father, like the scorned son of a powerful wizard, and that scorned son grows up to become a powerful wizard themselves, or warlock in this case, and then uses that magic to punish the father. All right, now I talked a little bit about Sir Ginger earlier, but I didn't mention the name. This is Sir Ginger the Meal Ender. 2 cost, 3/1, legendary artifact creature, food knight. Sir Ginger's partner was eaten in the last Eldraine preview season. Garrick picked him up off the table and bit him in half. And Sir Ginger went animal and picked up a fork and just jumped at Garrick to fight Garrick because of what Garrick did to her partner. So very cool, Sir Ginger. Let's read the card. It says Sir Ginger has trample, hexproof, and haste as long as an opponent controls a planeswalker. Whenever another artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on Sir Ginger and scry 1. And then 2, tap, sack it, and you gain life equal to its power. So very similar to most food, has the ability to sack itself to gain life, but this one is unique in that the life it gains is equal to its power. You also have the ability to grow it by sacrificing things like treasure tokens. I think that this card could be magnificent in Rakdos Sacrifice as a tool for pressuring opposing planeswalkers, but also just a way for you to utilize blood tokens, treasure tokens, and food tokens. And the ones that can sacrifice without any cost, like the treasure tokens, I think are going to be best because of how they work with the +1/+1 counter. But overall, I just think Sir Ginger is perfectly flavorful card. I love that her weapon of choice is a fork with a grape on it, and they're on the table fighting it through the food. And I always really like Ginger, and I'm glad that her card does her justice. She's awesome. Next up, Talion's Messenger. This is 2 and a blue for a 1/3 flyer, Fairy Noble. Whenever you attack with 1 or more fairies, draw a card, then discard a card. When you discard a card this way, put a 1/1 counter on target fairy you control. So this only happens once per attack. It's not per card. That means it's going to be limited pretty aggressively in what it can do. This card reminds me a lot of Rafine, but a bit weaker. Rafine scales pretty tremendously as the game progresses. Talion's Messenger does not. And because you're not physically gaining the card, and you can only do it essentially once per attack, and it's only 1 counter instead of for each spell you discard, I think Talion's Messenger is just not going to cut it in any format. I think this could have easily been uncommon. Tingle Colony, 1 and a black for a 3/2 rat. Can't block. And then when it dies, you create X/1/1 black rat tokens where this creature can't block, where X is the amount of damage dealt to it this turn. So if your opponent ever blocks it with a 2/2, you get 2 rats. If they block it with a huge thing, you get that many rats. If they don't block it, great, you're dealing them 3 damage with a 2-cost creature. So this is like Reckless Abandon. It's an old Magic card, but it's a great term for what we're doing in terms of pressuring our opponent ad nauseum. We're essentially just bearing them with permanence over the course of the game. With rat tokens, we're swarming, we're overwhelming, we are relentless in our pursuit of victory. And Tingle Colony represents that in a very tight little package, a 2 mana 3/2. And then, if your opponent hits it with a burn spell, you get some tokens. If they kill it with Fatal Push, you don't get tokens, but that's the downside, right? Tingle Colony is just another creature, unless it takes damage. And I think that you'll see that it's going to be okay in the rat decks. And I think the rat decks could end up being quite good. Next up is the Apprentice's Folly. 2 blue and a red for a saga. Now, to note, this is a normal saga. This is not a read ahead. Chapters 1 and 2 are the same. It says choose target non-token creature you don't or you control that doesn't have the same name as a token you do control. Create a token that's a copy of it, except it isn't legendary, is a reflection in addition to its other types, and has haste. Now, you keep that token until Apprentice's Folly reaches chapter 3, and then you sack all reflections you don't control. So, this is kind of a nod to Splinter Twin. You can use this with a big thing you have to make one copy, and then you could choose another big thing you have to make another copy. I think the fact that you need two things already in play by the time you cast it to get full value is a bit disheartening, because you can't target something that already has something with the same name. And so this card seems cool for a commander. I doubt it sees any play in constructed, but there might be some cool combos around it with Feldar Guardian and such. But I think that it's very complicated because they're trying to make sure it doesn't go infinite. But there might be a way to make it go infinite. We'll see. Next up, The End. I wish this was the last card we were doing today because of the name. The End is 2 in black for an instant. It costs 2 less to cast if your life total is 5 or less. So it costs black if you're at 5 or less. It says exile target creature planeswalker. Perfect. Searches controller's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with the same name as that permanent and exile them. That player shuffles, then draws a card for each card exiled from their hand this way. There's an old card cycle from Urza's block that does this. There was Splinter. There was one for enchantments, one for artifacts, and one for creatures. This is essentially an instant version of the black one. I believe it's not infinite obliteration, but it might be something like that. But basically, it's the same as that. But it costs 2 less if your life is 5 or less, and it's an instant. Whereas the other one was a sorcery. I think that this type of card is pretty cool and answers a lot of problems from decks that play only like 1 or 2 creatures, like Primeval Titan or Omnath, Locus of Creation, things that are like big baddies that are hard to deal with in multiples. And The End seems like a great answer for those. Next up is the Mother Goose, the Goose Mother. I've played this, or built this already in a deck on my Patreon. If you're interested in the Patreon, I'll link it again in chat for those who are looking for deck ideas for the Goose Mother. But for green, blue, and X, you get a 2/2 flyer. So green, blue, 2/2 flyer, pretty good baseline. It enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. So it scales nicely, 3 for a 3, 4 for 4, et cetera, et cetera. And then enters the battlefield, create half X food tokens rounded up. So for 3, you get 1 food. For 5, you get 2 food, and so on. And then whenever the Goose Mother attacks, you may sack a food. If you do, draw a card. So very similar to Hydroid Crisis and how it operates. It doesn't gain the life immediately when you cast it, but it starts larger. For 4 mana, Hydroid Crisis was only a 2/2 that drew a card and gained a life. This is going to be for 4, it's going to be a 4/4 that makes 1 food token. And then when you attack with it, it's going to draw a card, and then you can sack food to gain life as necessary. I think that this is going to be an excellent card, but it's not as good as most people think. It scales nicely with X, so you're going to want to play it along with a bunch of mana accelerators like Elvish Mystic and such. Next up is the Huntsman's Redemption. For 2 and a green, you get a saga. First chapter is make a 3/3 beast. Second chapter is you may sack a creature. If you do, search your library for a creature or basic land, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. Chapter 3 is up to 2 target creatures each get +2/+2 and gain trample until end of turn. This card's pretty cool. Reminds me a lot of Call the Herd, an old favorite from back in Odyssey, where for 3 you get a 3/3, and then later in the game it could gain some more value. This is free to gain more value, whereas that one costs 4 more mana to make another 3/3. This is going to be decent in like really aggressive green strategies, but it doesn't fit into green devotion. And I think that alone is going to be something that stifles it. If you could sack a creature and go get any land like Nykthos or Boseiju or Lair the Hydra, I think it would be obviously significantly better and maybe see play. But as it stands, you're going to need to play this in like a Stompy style deck, and that just doesn't really exist at the moment. Next up is the Iron Crag. This is the first mana rock we have in Pioneer that costs 2 mana. Iron Crag costs 2 for a legendary artifact. Taps for colorless. We don't have Mind Stone. We don't have talismans. We don't have anything of this sort. This is a brand new effect that's going to drastically alter how we build some decks. Whenever a legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may have the Iron Crag become a legendary equipment artifact named Everflame Hero's Legacy. If you do, it gains equip 3, and equipped creatures get +3/+3 and loses all their abilities. Now, the creature itself doesn't lose the abilities, but the Iron Crag essentially loses all the other abilities and becomes the equipment. That means that you're going to play Iron Crag early to accelerate into a 4-drop, hopefully a 5-drop after that. And then if one of them is legendary at some point, you can turn it into an equipment that just gives a nice little boost when you don't need the mana anymore. It's going to be bad in multiples because it's legendary, but if you draw multiples later on, it's going to be a bit better because you can have one that's the mana rock and one that's the uh, legendary equipment named Everflame because it changes names. So that's interesting. Next up, 3 blind mice, 2 and a white for a saga. First chapter is make a mouse. Second and third chapter, create a token that's a copy of target token you control to make rat 2 and rat 3, or mouse 2, mouse 3. These are different than rat tokens. These can block, rat tokens can't. Creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. So a pretty interesting card. This works a lot like History of Benalia for those of you who played that standard format. We're gonna make 1/1 instead of 2/2, so it's gonna be a bit worse there. But we do get an extra token, and we can maybe control the boost on that 4th chapter more easily. You're gonna play this along with a lot of other token generators, but mostly I just want uh, bigger tokens. So I'm curious what we can pair with this to make bigger tokens. I know that in Pioneer, there's a Selesnya card from Guilds or Ravnica second time around, where it's 2 costs to make a 3/3 token. Maybe that with 3 blind mice is pretty good. All right, we're getting down to the nitty gritty. Only a few more rares left. Thunderous Debut, 8 mana sorcery with bargain. So if you bargain, it's juiced. Look at the top 20 cards of your library. 20 is so many. You may reveal up to 2 creature cards from among them. If the spell was bargain, put the revealed cards onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put the revealed cards into your hand and shuffle. So 2 modes, very similar to Tooth and Nail. Even the art is looking back towards Tooth and Nail. So if those of you who've played Tooth and Nail before, it's a stellar effect. Search your deck for some big baddies and put them into play if you pay the Entwine. Instead of Entwine with Thunderous Debut, we're doing bargain. And I think that the effect on the game is going to be very similar, where if you pay 8 and bargain this, you're going to win the game more often than not. This card reminds me a lot of Indomitable Creativity, but with fewer hoops to jump through in terms of deck building, but a little bit more difficult to cast because it costs 8 instead of 4 or 5 with a variable cost. So really think Thunderous Debut is awesome, and I am curious to see how people build and what creatures they choose to put into play with it. It's also not a guarantee. Tooth and Nail, you got to search your whole deck. This only does top 20, so if your big threats are in the bottom 20, you're just SOL, and you got to pick from different ones. So threat density is going to be key in some builds. Next up is Twinning Twins. 4 mana for a 4/4 flying fairy wizard with vigilance and ward 1. So great stats on the front half. The Swift Spiral is the adventurer, and for a white and 1 instant, you get to exile target non-token creature, turn it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So we can use Swift Spiral to essentially blink our own stuff to generate extra bodies, draw cards. We can play it alongside 3 drops that bounce an opposing creature, so we get an extra bounce effect out of it. We can play it with Loyal Companion, or not Loyal Companion, Spirited Companion that can draw a card. There's a lot to love about a blink effect built into a really efficient creature package, and Twinning Twins as a 4 mana 4/4 flying Vig ward 1 is a great package. Very happy with this card. Excited to see if there's a blue-white blink deck that can utilize this in Pioneer. Next up, Werefox Bodyguard. 1 white for a 2/2 flash Elf Fox Knight. When it enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 other target non-fox creature until Werefox Bodyguard leaves the battlefield. So this is very Banisher Priest. There's a hunter in Innistrad block that did something very similar. We've had this type of effect on a creature multiple times before. This is one of the first ones I can recall having flash, reminiscent of Stasis Snare. And then it has also white and 1 sack it, you gain 2 life. So a lot to love about Werefox Bodyguard. The only downside is that it's not a human, so it's unlikely to make a splash in the mono white humans deck. They already play Skyclave Apparition and Brutal Cathar, and I don't think that this is better than either of those. Next up is Wildwood Mentor, 2 and a white for a 1/1 tree folk. It says whenever a token enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on Wildwood Mentor. That is any token, and it's not once per turn. That's a huge deal. When Wildwood Mentor attacks, another target attacking creature gets +X/+X until turn, where X is Wildwood Mentor's power. So we can make a bunch of tokens, juice Wildwood Mentor, and then when we attack, our 1 or 2 drop gets a huge buff. I think that Wildwood Mentor is pretty cool and will be interesting to see what it does in token-based strategies. Maybe this is something we can play at the top end of our Gleeful Demolition Naya, Convoke deck. Maybe Wildwood Mentor works really nicely alongside things like Venerated Luxon as well, since Venerated Luxon puts a counter on it if you use it to Convoke. Yeah, we'll see. It's a little expensive at 3 before you get started, so maybe not, but seems like a cool card. And then this is the last rare and the last card we're going to be doing on stream today. This is Yenna Redtooth Regent. For 2 and a white and a green, you get a 4/4 Elf Noble, legendary creature. And for 2 tap, you can choose target enchantment you control that doesn't have the same name as another permanent you control. And you create a token that's a copy of it, except it isn't legendary. If the token is an aura, untap Yenna and then scry 2, and you may activate only as a sorcery. So basically, you get to copy all your auras for 2 at a time, and you can only copy each aura once. You can copy any enchantment though, and then you don't get the untap in the scry. It's not until in a turn, right? So it's permanent. So it's a permanent copy. So that's why the card is powerful, right? You can make a permanent copy of one of your cards, but you can only do it once. If it's an aura, you get to untap and do it again. No, you didn't, Fozzie. We're going to be doing that in just a minute. So pretty sweet card. This is probably commander fodder for these Selesnya enchantments type decks that people really want to play. But yeah, this is it. This is Yenna Redtooth Regent. This is the last rare that we're going to be talking about today.